A good Tuesday morning to you on this June 1st. Thanks for tuning in to Real Talk. For those that are downloading the podcast, we hope you're having a great day. For those of you that are watching us live, we're grateful to have you here with us in community today. We say it, and we use the word intentionally, but it seems to mean a little bit more at times like these when as a collective, as a nation, we're coming together in anger, in grief, continuing to try to make sense of. We know we won't make sense of, to try to process the discovery. If I say of the 215, this number resonates, I know, with Canadians, and for that matter with people around the world that are paying attention to a grisly discovery out of Kamloops, BC, a discovery that many Indigenous people are saying should be no surprise to anyone. We will continue our coverage of this story today, including many of your emails. I'm looking in front of me. It's been a while since I've seen an outpouring like this of grief, of shame, of anger, of an earnest desire to understand what steps forward look like. In just a few moments, as a matter of fact, in about 10 minutes from now, we're going to talk to a Métis archaeologist by the name of Dr. Kisha Supernant. The doctor is the director of the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology. They put out a call, an open letter yesterday, as a matter of fact, calling on essentially the government of Canada and Canadians to respect and recognize steps that need to be taken before any conversations, let alone action, happens around other residential schools across the country. Many people are quite rightfully wondering why we've not yet used this same radar technology to determine, and I won't say if. My gut twists when I acknowledge to you, I won't say if. I will say where the other unmarked mass graves are. Let's get a clear sense, like Joanne Saddleback said to us on Friday. Let's stick with the truth right now before fast forwarding to reconciliation. That will be our goal today, and I'm looking forward to Dr. Supernant joining us coming up in about 10 minutes. We're going to take a look at some of the other stories making news. We are going to cover other issues over the next number of days and weeks and months as we continue our look at this story. It feels so insensitive to call it a story. It's our reality. Pardon me from time to time for invoking the word story. I recognize this is our reality. This is what we're talking about. This is, in many circumstances, all Canadians are talking about. These 215 souls. But we will focus on other items making news. We'll take a look around the country and around the world, as we do, at some of the noteworthy events. If you've been paying attention to the story of electric vehicles, you know there have been big advancements there, and one of them is pretty relevant, especially of interest, I think, to Canadians, to working Canadians, dare I say to blue-collar Canadians. I don't think actually that's a smart way to talk about pickups, because in our neck of the woods as well, there's a whole bunch of blue jean millionaires. Pickups are the chariot of choice. As a matter of fact, the Ford F-150, the best-selling truck, the best-selling vehicle in the United States. People love their trucks. Well, trucks are going electric now. How long till fleets are replaced? We're going to talk to Carnegie Mellon engineer and associate professor. I'm very much looking forward to Costa Samaras joining us on the show. Should be a great conversation. And then as we continue our discussions with the leaders of Canada's federal political parties, Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the federal NDP, will join us today. That's coming up in about an hour and a half from now. We'll do it live at 10 a.m. Mountain Time, noon Eastern. This show is presented by the team at Bitcoin Well. Crypto's taken a bit of a beating over the past few weeks. And for a lot of people, if that was the time you got in, you're going, wait a second, what's going on here? For a lot of the people that are hardcore into crypto, they're going, well, this is perfect. I never thought I'd have another chance to get in at this price level, right? It all depends on perspective. Do not take my perspective and apply it to you. Take your questions and ask them to the team at Bitcoin Well. They want the tough questions. It's their wheelhouse. You'll find them under the sponsors tab right at the top of the page at ryanjesperson.com.
Real Talk starts right now. Here's Ryan Jesperson.
You can be in touch with us anytime to talk at ryanjesperson.com. You can also, of course, Use our hashtag if you're on Twitter, if you're on Instagram, Real Talk RJ. It's powered by Park Power. That's the hashtag that we keep an eye on. And many of you have been in touch with us over the past number of days, most especially the past couple of days, as we've talked more and more about that horrific discovery. The 215 souls, the bodies of children, some of them as young as 3 years old, essentially dumped in a mass grave outside a former residential school in Kamloops. A nation is horrified. Sonny took the time to write in to talk at RyanJesperson.com, says, here's the opinion of an invisible Indigenous person. Carrying the guilt of a fair-skinned Métis has caused me much angst, but not nearly as much as watching my relatives and friends experience humiliation, violence, discrimination, heartbreak, racism, hatred. Most of us survive by not thinking about the disadvantages we individually and collectively have, the struggles we've had to overcome. When we do think about them, it's traumatic and distressing and painful. So here I am, Ryan, awake. It's 4 a.m. I'm weeping over all the stories I've heard in my lifetime, the injustices I've witnessed myself. I always trick myself into believing the years of therapy wiped away the pain, but not true. I've learned coping skills that get me through the pain every day. And there's my kids. They're my joy. There are a variety of opinions within the Indigenous community. People are at various stages of healing, of self-awareness, of desperation, trauma. There's no single solution for every Indigenous person. Just like any cultural community, we experience the world individually. We have differing opinions. Reconciliation means something different to every person. I hope that you can promote a respect for every individual where they are in their journey of healing. Some want immediate action. That's not my belief. I believe we need to experience the trauma that's being created by imperialism and colonialism. Others believe we've shared our stories enough. It's traumatic to live through the most difficult times again and again, but most settlers don't understand the profound grief and anguish the Indigenous communities have carried, or how that eats at and destroys your soul. Intergenerational trauma is not easily overcome because it's still happening. There are generations of shame, of humiliation, poverty, indignity to overcome. It will take Indigenous people generations to heal. Epigenetics reveal trauma is imprinted on our DNA. We can recover and heal, but we need the support of society to do that. We need patience, compassion, trust. One of the requirements to achieve healing is to identify cause. The creators, the perpetuators of genocide, blaming it on systemic racism is too nebulous. You can't change what you don't understand. I know what the causes are, who the creators are, and who perpetuates systemic racism, but I'm one insignificant citizen. I cannot change the world by myself. Change comes from widespread pressure and social desire, and that will only happen if we know the cause and who continues to create genocidal outcomes. Thanks for Real Talk. Thanks for the issues and topics you explore. You bring to awareness. Your show has made me angry, sad, shocked, thrilled, excited, hopeful, and pensive, sometimes all in 1/2 hour. Thank you for being willing to dive deeper into the issues and to not be afraid of the truth. Keep up the good work. I appreciate that. What about this from an individual who wrote in trust, asking that he only be identified as a firefighter in a major Canadian city, an urban center. To my Real Talk brothers and sisters, I'm heartbroken and I'm raging mad. I'm struggling with this one big time. I'm so furious with the Catholic Church that they never face any kind of justice, and I'm raging mad at a government that ignores and does very little on this file, but perhaps now maybe things will change for the better. Never in my life have I been so embarrassed to say I'm Canadian. I travel out of country whenever I can. We literally, in my mind, went overnight from a country that was perceived through global eyes as peaceful, just, and kind to a what the hell is going on over there. I'm so heartbroken. I found myself weeping today in the kitchen, recalling many hard calls we've responded to over the years. Downtown, dealing with our Indigenous population, suicide, cold weather exposure deaths, overdoses, homicides. I recall many times with shame returning to our truck, and we'd collectively respond, another Indian. They're fucked. Brother, I am so broken that I felt that way. And I now see through these residential schools, we broke these people. Their spirit, their will, their reverence for the land. I pray somehow they can return to their ways and their relationship with the land, with their traditions, with their families. That from a firefighter from a major Canadian urban center. We're going to keep your emails real. I'm going to keep getting to these. I have more than a dozen of them in front of me. You can be in touch with the show anytime to talk at ryanjesperson.com. We recognize that these conversations are going to be very difficult for some people. And it's also important to us that we remind you of the resources that are available as we continue to explore what meaningful commitment to truth and reconciliation looks like. I want to let you know that if you need support, if you're looking for support services or more information, you can reach the National Indian Residential School Crisis Line. And the number is 1-866-925-4419. The National Indian Residential School Crisis Line, 1-866-925-4419. Yesterday, we saw a immediate release from the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology. We're going to be talking to an associate professor from the Department of Anthropology at the University of Alberta in just a moment. It essentially touches on, in particular, obviously, the graves associated with the Kamloops Indian Residential School. But the question is where to go and what to do from here. Whose opinion, whose feedback, whose direction matters most? Dr. Kisha Supernant is the director of the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology, our guest this morning on Real Talk. Thank you for making time for us and welcome to the show. I think, Doctor, we may have you on mute, so we'll just make sure we can get your mic and make sure we can hear you clearly. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Glad to have you here. Doctor, I suppose right now, you obviously have a professional and a personal expertise that'll be directly relevant here to our conversation. May I just ask you as a fellow human being, how are you processing what you heard out of obviously the grounds of this former residential school in Kamloops now just a few days later?
Well, like I think many of us, I'm very heartbroken and devastated at the news, and I think the emails you've been sharing this morning reflect that. Like some, of my Indigenous colleagues, though, I'm not surprised, right? Having done work like this in other contexts, there are graves of children around every residential school. So this is not a unique situation. This is not a unique circumstance. I think the scale and the numbers are really hitting hard for many non-Indigenous Canadians. And it's been a hard few days for me. I'm an Indigenous person. I have connections to residential schools. I am a mother of a 6-year-old, and all of that means that this is heavy times and heavy news.
Why do you think that this story, this particular discovery, is resonating like it is across Canada? I mean, we've had so many people, whether they're civilians, so to speak, audience members, or expert guests, say this shouldn't be a surprise to anybody.
I mean, it's hard to know exactly why this story resonates. I think it's partly the scale. When people hear the number 215, it hits home in a way that some of these other contexts, I've worked on schools where we found potentially, 30 children, but that number didn't seem to resonate in the same way of this 215 children. I think also talking about the ages, right? Some of these children were as young as 3. And I think maybe people are ready to push for action on this, to address the TRC calls to action in a way that maybe they weren't before. And I think it's really unfortunate that it took something of this scale to garner this amount of attention, because Indigenous communities have been asking for this type of work to be done even before the TRC calls to action came out. So I hope this is a time that we can actually move forward and take action around this.
Doctor, can you explain for us specifically how this discovery was made? I mean, there's the discovery itself, which is so appalling, and this number, which is searing itself into Canadians' sort of collective awareness. And tragically, I suspect and I would predict that number will continue to rise. Most notably, if Canada does what I think the nation needs to do, and we'll talk about this under which circumstance it's appropriate. But of course, looking at the grounds and conducting forensic investigations on the grounds of every former residential school. But can you explain the technology to us and what's different now as opposed to maybe even just several years ago?
Sure. I know the technology that was used in the Kamloops case. I don't know exactly the technical details because I was not involved in the project, but I have done other types of projects that use this technology. So there has been use of ground penetrating radar in archaeological contexts and forensic contexts for actually many, many years. So this technology is not new, but we have been refining its use in unmarked grave contexts for some time. So basically, the type of technology that's used in this case is a form of remote sensing. So it's a way to look below the surface of the ground without digging. And ground penetrating radar is one of a number of different types of remote sensing that can be used. It's the most common to be used around graves. What it actually is a small antenna. It's shaped like a box usually, and it is dragged across the surface of the ground, and it sends a signal down into the ground, and that signal bounces back differently depending on the soil below. So it's really looking for disturbances or changes within the soil or within the materials below the surface. And we drag it along at very set intervals to try to pick up possible disturbances. In the case of graves, what is typically seen is the grave shaft. So where the actual pit itself is dug is what the ground penetrating radar might pick up. And if there is a coffin burial, and in these cases, there may or may not be. It depends on where they were buried and how they were buried. But if there is a coffin, the ground penetrating radar can sometimes detect the coffin as well. So we don't see bodies in this technology. What we see are the actual grave pits themselves.
So can you give us a sense? I'll acknowledge you weren't there, and I'll acknowledge you were not working on the project, but obviously you're an expert in the field. How accurate would you believe the specific number? It's not 200 plus, it's 215. How would they arrive to a number like that?
I'm not sure how they arrived at that particular number in this case, but I can tell you how we tend to do it in other cases that I've worked on. So we do have ways to estimate the number of possible or probable grave locations. There are some criteria that we would typically use to determine what a grave would look like. So, a certain depth below the surface, covering a certain amount of area, right? So if it's say a signal that's only on one line and we're running a line every 25 centimeters across the ground, then we might say that may not be a grave. But something that stretches across multiple, has a general rectangular shape, we can say with more confidence that this is a likely grave location. So in this case, I would guess that they had seen 215 anomalies of some kind. But not knowing the technical details, I can't speak to how that number was arrived at. But if I had been doing the project, that's how the number would have come up in my approach.
Based on your years of study and your professional experience, your academic experience, noting that Canada had nearly 140 residential schools, I think 139. It's estimated that at least 150,000 Indigenous children were taken from their families to attend these schools. Do you believe that it's important that every single former site be investigated forensically using this technology or comparable technology? Do you believe there should be 138 additional investigations?
I would say if communities want, then yes. So for me, we have to listen to what the communities whose relatives attended these schools want to have happen, and then they should be resourced to do whatever that might be. So if communities are ready and want this investigation to take place, then I believe that it should. But it is complex because many of these schools had children from multiple nations. So you need those nations to come together to agree on an approach. You need to have the right supports for communities who wish to do this, because it is extremely difficult work, even just something like ground penetrating radar. And that's only at the surface, right? If there wants to be work about identification or about identifying cause of death, holding people accountable, that requires even more careful forensic work. And that is extremely painful work to do. Can you imagine if there's thousands of children's graves around residential schools? To investigate all of them is at a scope and a scale that this nation has never seen. Other nations have done work around mass graves and around genocide, but that has not happened at the scale in Canada. And I think we have to do it with such care and not just assume that we should show up at every school and do these surveys tomorrow, because communities have to have a say in what is the appropriate way to do this around the schools where their relatives went.
Let me put up on the screen. This is a tweet that you sent yesterday. I don't typically do this with guests, but maybe I'll ask you to read it. You're the one that wrote it.
Yeah. When calling for action on Indian residential school grave sites, remember that Indigenous communities must be the ones to decide what happens to their relatives. Where communities are ready, they must be resourced to do the work, but for some, finding the locations of the children may be too painful.
When we saw that, we took pause. It's something that I will acknowledge even myself. My first reaction, I need to learn to listen better. This is, I think, something that as a nation we need to do. We've already had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Elders and Indigenous people en masse have dug deep into returning to their own pain, to returning to their own trauma, to share it, to contribute it, to gift those perspectives. So as a nation, we can better understand. Yet, really, if you look at the report and how much of it has been adopted or acted upon, really, as a nation, you wouldn't be blamed if you were to believe that really Canada didn't take it that seriously. Regardless, my initial response here is we need to do this everywhere. We need to better understand what's going on. But again, the perspective that you bring is so important. I mean, I guess you can tell I'm trying to wrap my mind around this live as we speak, because it's an ongoing process. These are mass graves, and you talk about other countries that have unearthed these types of things, and I think to the worst atrocities in recorded human history. The perspective of a school with an unmarked mass grave outside, you almost have to just keep saying that sentence until it hits you. And then to understand where to go from there. We continue to subject these communities, and we subject individuals, we re-traumatize people again and again and again. And it's hard to understand, I think, how, I don't say move forward in a way to leave it behind, quite the opposite, in fact, but how to act.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I think we're seeing a lot of different calls and a lot of push towards action, which I think is extremely important, because there is the danger that it'll just be commemoration. It'll just be people will put their flags at half-mast and put shoes on the legislature, which are all very important. But that's not necessarily action toward justice and toward commemoration of these children's burial places. At the same time, I think there's a lot of people who are rushing to say, we have to do this. We should dig up all the children. We should, do all this work. But I just want people to pause for a moment and listen, because I've been in communities talking about doing the surveys about their children. And even in those conversations, there's some people who just like leave them be, right? And we just need to listen and not to, like I said, show up with a bunch of equipment and say, we're going to do this for you. Communities have to say, we want this. And we collectively come together and here's what we want to have happen. And this is what we see in the Kamloops story. This is driven by Kamloops, right? So they made this decision. Kamloops Shwepmek said, this is something we want to do. And that's great. And we want to support and resource them to do that work. And where other communities are ready to do that as well. But we can't just rush in and say it all must happen right now. And I think it's really important to employ these methods and forensic methods to this. I've heard the calls for people treating these like crime scenes, and in many cases they are. But there's also a very fraught relationship between Indigenous communities and the policing system. And as soon as you start to call something a crime scene, it implies that the RCMP should be involved in an important way. And I think we have to be very cautious about that as well, because there's a very, like I said, fraught and long-standing difficult relationship between the RCMP and Indigenous communities. So stop and listen to what communities want, and then provide the resources to meet those needs is the approach that I would advocate.
Including, I'm assuming you're suggesting investigations funded by the federal government. I don't want to make assumptions. Would that be your suggestion?
Absolutely. And I think there needs to be a national strategy for this, so that there are also not only funds that can go to communities, but that there's shared understandings of how to best apply the methods. Right? So one of the things that I've been hearing over the last few days is that there are companies, for example, who do these types of surveys for development or for engineering purposes. And they're like, we've got this equipment, we can go do it. But there's very specific protocols for how you identify a grave. It's not the same as trying to figure out where to put a pipeline. And so I not only think there should be a funding package that goes to communities, and my understanding is the federal government is working on that, and there are some funds that have been allocated. They're not yet flowing to communities, but I hope that will happen soon. But I also think there needs to be that coordinated effort among those of us who have done this work, because I'm not the only archaeologist who's used these methods on behalf of communities, to come together to say, here are the things that are the best practices, so that we're not going into communities and providing either false positives or false negatives, right? So giving them, we want to give them as accurate information as we possibly can. And I and others have been working on trying to really refine these methods of remote sensing in order to provide the best information to communities.
Every once in a while I have a question I'm nervous to ask, so I go on some big preamble because I don't want it to be taken the wrong way, but I'll make this as concise as possible. I believe that, to me, the number 215 is extremely important, and I wish that there were names attached. If anybody goes to a Holocaust Memorial Museum, or if you go to Ground Zero in New York City, or the Vietnam War Memorial, like whatever, and I'm not tying together the stories, I'm just saying what resonates is the names, not necessarily the number. Yeah, I shared yesterday an impromptu dog walk on Sunday. I walked through a cemetery, and I was just being bombarded with emotions and the thought exercise of marked graves and unmarked graves, and whose losses we've mourned as a community and whose losses we have not, or at least whose mourning was delayed by, in some cases, decades or perhaps a century. And the names are so important, and 215 is important because every single one of them was a human being, a child that did not have a chance. And of those 215, there are countless others, hundreds more, who survived atrocities. At the same time, we recognize, and you point out, that some communities may not be prepared or may have no desire to understand the specific number, or to unearth, either metaphorically or literally, to unearth these bodies that have been laid to rest in a certain context. How important do you think a specific number is, or when it comes to the data and the evidence, for Canadians to be able to properly process this, for this to have meaning, for us to be able to pursue reconciliation truly? How important is the data and the evidence to you, in your opinion?
So I think that wherever we can, having specific names and having numbers communicates to non-Indigenous Canadians in a different way than, unfortunately, a lot of the stories have. So one of the reasons I think that this particular story out of Kamloops has resonated is it's the idea that we've now produced evidence of, right? So that we've used the scientific methods and applied them in these cases, and we can show that to non-Indigenous Canadians. And in my own experience, that type of scientific approach often does lend more weight to the stories of Indigenous communities. I hope for a world where we don't have to use the science, that communities can just be believed about their experiences. But I do think that the data resonates with people in a different way. I also want to say that I don't think we'll ever be able to find all of the children. And that's because of stories that we hear from survivors, where not all children were buried.
Yes.
And so the truth is we're never going to know the full number. And many of the records, the archival records have gaps, have probably deliberate gaps at times. And so we will do our best to try to tell the story, but we'll never fully know how many children were lost. I think it's important to remind non-Indigenous Canadians about the numbers are going to get much higher. And the numbers that the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation has produced, is the best they can do based on the archives that are available. But there are many more children who were lost than are accounted for in the records. And that is the reality that we're facing today. So I think numbers are important, but you're right. Every single child who didn't come home was a human with a family who loved them, right? And they never got to grow up. They never got to, have a life. And that pain resonates in communities today. But I also think the point about survivors is really important too. We are not just our trauma as Indigenous people. We are resilient. We are still here. And we want a better future, right? So I think for some communities, this is a way to a better future, is to seek justice, to hold people accountable, to lay these children to rest properly in the ways that are meaningful for the community, that involve the ceremonies, involve that work that these children never had.
Doctor, let me ask you this in closing. I'm so grateful for your time and for your perspective here. And I can tell you that I quickly looked in on our live chat, and the audience is very appreciative of the perspective that you're bringing here. And there's a whole lot of other things to think about as well. People talking about their relationship with Canada. Haas says there just was something not right, it seemed, last night. The Leafs and the Canadians, Game 7, playing the national anthem right after a moment of reflection, said it felt like something just not right about that. I'll be honest with you. I've been thinking a lot about what Canada means to me, and what, I host events for a living professionally, and it's become more and more common for land acknowledgements at the beginning of events, and I've wondered how that might evolve or become perhaps more mainstream or more adopted by people. There's so many ways that I think people will apply their pain or perhaps their motivation when it comes to this story and the steps that they personally take. And we're getting a whole bunch of emails talking about people's personal steps that they're taking. One of our audience members just enrolled for the Indigenous Studies course at the University of Alberta. They said, that's one thing I can do. That's one thing I can control. And so we will continue to explore these, and we'll continue to learn about these. But there's accountability. And a lot of people are saying right now the federal government's got a list with more than 5,000 names on it of people that in some circumstances have been asked to essentially provide testimony about their involvement in residential schools. It wasn't just the Catholic Church. It wasn't just the church. It wasn't just the federal government. It wasn't just the RCMP. There were civilians, community members that worked at these residential schools. What does accountability look like to you?
That I don't know if it's for me to say. Again, I think communities have to tell us what that justice looks like. And I think in some cases, there are grounds for criminal proceedings. I also think accountability is not just about residential schools here, right? So yes, there needs to be accountability for those who harmed the children, but there also needs to be accountability for the ongoing harm that Indigenous communities experience in the nation we call Canada. So this is part of a colonial system. This is a part of a system that has sought to dispossess us and, make us not proud to be Indigenous for hundreds of years, even before Canada was a nation. So I think for me, accountability has to sit in that broader conversation about, yes, how do we hold accountable those who harmed our children? But our children are still being harmed. And we need to also keep that conversation at the forefront today. So I guess I would say, in terms of the specifics around any school, we need to take our lead from communities. What do they want? And then support them to seek justice. But we also, I call on all non-Indigenous Canadians in particular to reflect on how there are ongoing injustices. There are children who are still taken away from their communities through child welfare systems. I'm the daughter of a 60s soup survivor. I didn't grow up with my community because my father was taken away from his mother at birth. And so I live with that legacy every day. And so I really want Canadians to reflect not only on this. If you're outraged by this, be also outraged that Canada's fighting for the rights of Indigenous children, against the rights of Indigenous children in court, that reserves still don't have clean drinking water, that Indigenous children are way overrepresented in the child welfare system. So this is not the past, this is the present. And if we want a better future, then we all need to point out these injustices and call for action.
Dr. Kisha Supernant is director of the Institute of Prairie and Indigenous Archaeology, an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Alberta. Thank you so much for this. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
We'll get to your comments, your emails through the show. I mean, some people are just writing and saying, I didn't know nearly enough about this. Yvonne says when people went to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that gathering in Edmonton, almost half, it seemed people barely knew about residential schools, let alone horrific crimes committed there. This dark, ugly history has been hidden for far too long. Dwayne says there are people who will say this didn't happen. They will say there is no proof. That is obviously not true, says Dwayne. Renee says the government needs to force the Catholic Church to release all records from this time, then strike a commission to go through these records and name these children. Yeah, I've seen some interesting thoughts on that. I saw somebody yesterday talking about accountability. I recognize for a lot of people this is an extremely hot button issue for a lot of reasons. Quite frankly, at this point, I don't think it's relevant. Or I guess I'm saying, quite frankly, I don't really care about religious sensitivities. I think it's time to have very real conversations about big organizations, big wealthy organizations that are given a pass all the time for horrific, perpetual, mass-scale atrocities, oftentimes perpetrated on children, most times perpetrated on children. But this person was making the argument yesterday that it's a little bit too simple to just blame the church or to just blame the Catholic Church. Other churches were involved, laypersons, community members, police, societal structures, politicians of the time. So what does accountability look like? I would ask you, as I vow to you that I will do, continue to walk with this and think about it, and feel free to be in touch with us as you're trying to make sense of what integrity looks like, what Canada looks like with this discovery and the reality, of course, that will continue to haunt this nation. We've got people that are writing in and just saying, I don't know. I don't really know the right thing to say. Sometimes I feel like I'm stepping in it a little bit. Tanya wrote us an email yesterday. The subject line, my live chat epic fail, says I tried and failed miserably to introduce a question into the Real Talk live chat on Monday. So I wanted to collect my thoughts and try again. Indigenous children are in state care, suffering. Indigenous kids being bounced around our system, unable to access the same health care as non-Indigenous kids. They're suffering. In many cases, Indigenous families don't have a full understanding of who their ancestors were or where they were buried as stolen children. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There are decades of work ahead of us here to truly understand, reconcile, heal this injustice. I see people of all walks and all faiths angry and upset and wanting to do something meaningful. This includes people in the Catholic community, of which, says Tanya, I'm not a member. I was trying unsuccessfully to say this in the live chat before it became apparent I dug myself into a hole and it was wiser to just stop digging. I didn't see it. Did you see it yesterday? I don't know. There must have been a flare-up on the live chat. I missed it. I appreciate this follow-up. Tanya says that the Truth and Reconciliation, the calls to action, number 46, speaks to having the parties of residential schools come together to sign a covenant of reconciliation. It provides little in terms of tangibles that need to happen within that covenant, aside from broad language. I can only guess the language is broad in order to recognize the incredible complexity of the liabilities, in other words, the money involved. My question is really this. I want to know what those tangible things are and what we random little people in our communities can do to move these things forward. Sure, I could put on an orange shirt. I could make sure my kids wear one too. I could read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's recommendations. I could take courses. I can learn more about Indigenous peoples. I could change my profile photo on Facebook and I could put children's shoes on the steps of the legislature, and I could scoff at the legalese and all the letters from these letters from these bishops, and I can nod solemnly as flags are lowered to half staff. And I can rage at people in the YouTube comments section, but it all seems either about generating awareness and knowledge or superficial and not particularly helpful. I know the first part of change starts with awareness, but at what point does awareness need to give way to real action? Those 215 children and thousands more like them in days past and present deserve more than my wardrobe choice for a day or two. So what's our call to action? Some real talkers put a few ideas out there, and I want to hear more, particularly from Indigenous voices. How can we ensure that action happens where needed at residential schools? How can we bring those kids home to their communities? Isn't that interesting? It kind of touches on what Dr. Supernant just talked about. Tanya wonders, how do we encourage or push or engage organizations that were involved in these residential schools to more meaningful apology and action? How do we make recommendation number 46 a reality? What else is out there and not getting attention or action as it deserves? How do we harness the people power that has moved other real change, like coal mining on the eastern slopes, to make real change for these kids? A real talk segment on real action would be really appreciated. That from Tanya. Well, we'll commit to you that we're on it. And I'm not saying that dismissively, quite the opposite, in fact. I wouldn't bring producer Sarah Hoyles on to ask what we're doing on this front, because she'd probably say, well, which day do you want me to talk about? You want me to talk about tomorrow or the next day or the next day or the next day or the next day or the next day? We have a list. Let us just prove it. Let's not talk about it. We'll gather here in community every single weekday. We'll cover a bunch of stories. We'll make sure that you know what you need to know about what's going on in the world around you, and we'll leave plenty of time to talk about it. And through it all, real talk on real action. Tanya, thanks for that. We want to remind you that the team at Park Power powers our hashtag each and every day. We keep an eye on it through the show and, of course, through the afternoon when the podcast drops on all of our subscribers. That's when the hashtag really picks up. Real Talk RJ, of course, Park Power at parkpower.ca, providing internet, electricity, and natural gas using the promo code 2021-Real Talk. If you haven't taken your business there, do it today. Takes a minimal amount of time. Trust me, you'll be surprised. You can take your business anywhere you like, and why not let them buy you dinner one night? $70 off your first bill using the promo code 2021-Real Talk at parkpower.ca. Our friends at Alta Moving and Storage know that this is the time of year that you're probably going to make a move. Who wants to move in January? Nobody. So why not take the stress out of your summer move by going with one of their pod-style moving containers? They drop it off at your house. They give you as much time as you need to get it loaded up. They'll even provide the movers if need be. And then same deal on the other end. They could store the pod for you for a bit, or they drop off that container at your new digs. And of course, you unpack it at your pace. It's what Alta Storage is all about, finding solutions from their family business to your family's business. You'll find them online at altastorage.ca. Make sure you tell them you heard about them on Real Talk. And a big shout out to our friends at Sherwood and St. Albert Dodge. 'Tis the season to be getting outdoors, whether that's pulling a trailer, whether that's busting out the old tent. We know that people are going to be finding ways to stay local but still get outside this summer. No better way to do it than in that Jeep lineup. The Jeep lineup, the best selection in the province of Alberta. You're going to find it at Sherwood and St. Albert Dodge. Check out their inventory online. Of course, they can share their two inventories between the two dealerships, and they do have, I saw it out in St. Albert Dodge. I, as a matter of fact, drove it a little bit. That new Jeep Wrangler, that 4xe. That's right. The electric Jeep Wrangler has touched down at St. Albert Dodge. Kind of a perfect time to welcome our next guest. We've been looking forward to this conversation for a while. He's recognized as an expert in the field of climate policy and certainly as a strong voice when it comes to electric vehicles in North America and around the world. Costa Samaras is an associate professor at Carnegie Mellon University and adjunct senior researcher at the RAND Corporation, where they inform decisions about climate resilience, electric transportation, and decarbonized energy systems. Welcome to Real Talk. Really happy to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Great to be with you, Ryan.
You know, I guess it was a matter of fact, a tweet that you sent out a while ago, some insights you had on the new electric Ford F-150. You're talking about that big pickup truck there, in particular the weight. And I thought, oh boy, that's the type of thing that people in our neck of the woods are going to be really interested in, because I think that there's a bit of an understanding that when you're talking about EVs, you're talking about these tiny little puddle jumpers, these grocery getters, but it's almost everything's going electric these days.
You know, I don't drive a pickup truck. I walk and bike to work, but I think that the electric pickup truck is the most important thing to happen for decarbonization in my lifetime. And the reason is, Ryan, is that lots of people drive pickup trucks. They're very popular in the United States. They're very popular in Canada. And if we have lots of folks driving electric, we're going to get much closer to meeting our climate objectives.
Do you think, is there a cultural barrier that needs to be overcome when it comes to certain? I mean, let me put it this way. Let me just cut to the chase. You talk to a lot of guys that drive, a lot of people that'll drive diesel trucks, and they talk about rolling coal, and they love to blow off the big exhaust. You know exactly what I'm talking about, that big puff, or people love the sound. People love the sort of, I'm going to go back to the Tim the Toolman Taylor kind of the nature of these vehicles. A silent pickup truck. You think that's going to be a mental thing that people need to get over?
Well, I think everybody will have to change their mindset about what it means to have sustainable and high performance transportation, right? So these electric vehicles, they have instant torque, right? That means you step on the gas pedal, no longer a gas pedal, step on the accelerator pedal, and the vehicle just shoots right off the line. And that's because there's no transmission, right? It shoots right off the line. And I think once people start driving these vehicles, they'll get a sense of what they're capable of. The other thing that's nice is like they have plugs in the back. And if you're working on a job site somewhere and you want to plug in your tool, your power tools, or you recharge your power tool batteries, you want to put on the stereo, like all of the things that makes working remotely exciting happens inside of this electric truck.
Why is it that, I mean, that's quite a statement for you to make right out of the gates here. You say you think that the electric truck is basically, if I can paraphrase, the biggest thing that's going to happen in sustainability in your lifetime. I mean, all things considered, of all the things you could have chosen, solar panels or whatever, I won't start going down the list. That's a huge statement. What is it about trucks?
Well, let me clarify. For transportation.
Okay.
Right. So on the other, I'll just put a note here before my mentions start blowing up. The other end, I think, is the electric bike. right? So you take the electric bike and electric pickup truck, and you're really solving a big challenge in transportation. But let me stay with the truck, Ryan. There are 250 million cars and SUVs in the United States. There's nearly 24 million cars and SUVs in Canada. A lot of those are trucks. And in the United States, the pickup truck is the number 1, 2, and 3 most popular vehicle sold every year. And if we're going to solve climate change, we need to be electrifying everything. We have to clean the grid. We have to move more while driving less. That's important as well. We have to make sure we have safe streets and we expand our public transport system. And this is the big and. We need electric work trucks and electric bigger cars for the folks who need those for their jobs and for their life.
What are the trade-offs, Doctor, when it comes to this? Obviously, there's a lot of pros. What are the cons?
So you mentioned the weight of these vehicles. Nearly 3,000 kilograms. Double the weight of a sedan, right? Of a regular Toyota Corolla, and with more weight becomes more risk when you get into a crash, right? And so we already have a huge epidemic of car crashes, injuries, and fatalities on our roadways. Adding more weight to the mix is not going to make that better. But what we need to do in conjunction with electrifying transportation is to have safe streets. What does that mean? Streets that are designed around people, not giant cars. We need to have protected bike infrastructure, protected pedestrian infrastructure, accessible sidewalks, right? Expanded public transit, all the things that make moving around safe for pedestrians and cyclists. We need to expand at the same time. So one of the trade-offs with a big electric truck is it's really high off the ground. You can't really see people as you're driving. It takes the situation that's already dangerous for pedestrians and cyclists and amps it up a little bit. Now, I think that we can solve both of these issues at the same time with electrified transportation and safe streets.
I wonder if also the weight of the vehicles may have an implication with regards to crumbling infrastructure, with regards to strain on roadways and things like that. Is that relevant, do you think?
It is relevant. Most of the damage that we see on roadways comes from bigger trucks, not just pickup trucks, bigger trucks hauling freight that don't have the proper number of axles, right? So, the damage on a road exponentially goes up with the amount of weight that the vehicle has. So most of the damage that you see on roadways is generally caused by the big trucks that don't have the proper number of axles. But for sure, at the margin, a little bit extra weight in this pickup truck is going to take a little bit more lifetime out of the roads. And we need to be reinvesting in our infrastructure to make sure that it's easier to get around without using a car, but also making sure that our roads and our infrastructure are safe for the climate of the future, not just the climate of the past.
Dr. Samaras, we've got some interesting comments here on our live chat. Tawny says, I love the idea of electric vehicles, but what about charging stations? What happens to the battery at the end of its life? Jillian says, I would love if my next truck was electric or even a hybrid. But right now I get about 1,000 kilometers, call it 600 miles to a full tank. So I need that electric battery to go way further. But I sure do love that new truck can power up other things. Have those objections, so to speak, been answered? Things like range, convenience, battery life, or rather what we do with the batteries at the end of their lives?
Yeah, all these things are advancing, and they're advancing rapidly. The cost of an electric vehicle battery has come down more than 90% in the last 10 years. The range has gotten bigger as the battery technology has improved. To get 1,000 kilometers, we still have a little bit to go. But I think that there's going to be a set of first adopters for electric vehicles as more and more models become available that are going to fit their needs and fit their lifestyle. Most people are going to likely be charging at home, Ryan. If they can. Now, there's an equity issue involved, and we want to make sure that people who don't have access to charge at home can charge on the street or charge in parking lots. But most of people are going to be, for their daily use, charging these at home, going out and using them, coming back and not really much different. But we do need to expand the nationwide North American fast charging network so people can depend on getting around where they need to go and charging up really quickly. And the last thing you mentioned, Ryan, was that what do we do at the end of life? And so we work a lot on this of the batteries. We work a lot on the life cycle impacts of energy and technology. And so we have to be planning for minimizing the total amount of environmental damages from the transition to electrified transportation as we can. And that means having conflict-free minerals. That means having the cleanest possible industrial supply chain as we can, and pushing on all angles of this system to make sure that we have sustainability, not just in the transportation system, but across all of our systems.
How do you feel when it comes to the ethics of it? I really appreciate that you reference conflict-free minerals because, I mean, these are some of the valid objections. People are saying, with regards to the general population, we feel so good if we go green. I mean, if I get the keys to a brand new, Wrangler 4xe, I feel pretty good about myself. But at the same time, what do I know about where they got the lithium or whatever else goes into it? I won't start digging myself a hole there. How do you feel ethically about where manufacturing is at right now, where materials are being sourced?
This is something that everybody has to keep pushing on, right? And that means sustainable supply chains, labor rights, environmental sustainability up and down the supply chain across the global transition to electric vehicles. We're not going to be able to have 300 million electric vehicles in North America using the same materials that we're using now. We have to make sure that we're advancing on technology and reinvesting in technology to make sure that the battery materials are safe, clean, and conflict-free. I'm confident that we can get there. On the other side of the equation, though, Ryan, is what happens when if we stay with oil. That's no free lunch either, right? I mean, so like there are challenges and ethical dilemmas across electric. There are challenges and ethical dilemmas across the petroleum supply chain. I'm confident we have a pathway to get there with electric, and I don't know if there's a pathway to get there with oil.
Costa, how do you feel about government subsidies here? I mean, at different levels, at the state or provincial level, at the federal level. I know a lot of people have made the simple observation that a technology that's viable should survive without government subsidy. Now, I know that people are going to groan and they're screaming at their computers right now and saying, he just got out of talking about fossil fuels, and you're going to imply that there's no subsidies to fossil fuels. Give your head a shake, Jesperson, and my mentions are going to blow up. Let's acknowledge that we've seen subsidies all over the place when it comes to energy, when it comes to transportation, but in particular, governments that subsidize the purchase of EVs tend to take shots for it. I'm not sure if it's a loud minority or a majority perspective, but where do you land on that?
Throughout history and recent history, governments subsidize things that we want more of, right? Housing, education, and other goods. And what we're doing is we're bringing the cost in line with the benefits. Now, when you drive a kilometer on gasoline, you are creating climate change damages, air pollution damages, congestion, crash risk. All these things are expanding when you're driving on gasoline. When you drive on clean electricity, the congestion and the crash risk is still there, but now the climate change damages and the air pollution damages are greatly reduced or eventually get to zero when you have a completely clean grid. So we should be willing to internalize some of these costs to get some of this newer technology down the cost curve. The reason that we have battery electric vehicles are really way more competitive than we ever thought that we would have them over the last 10, 15 years is because government took risk on advancing technologies that brought the cost down as learning and manufacturing improved. So absolutely, things that manage climate change, we should be looking at smart ways to efficiently and equitably use government policy to improve technology that improves both people's lives and improve sustainability. It's
been interesting to see some of the world's major automakers put specific numbers out there with regards to the year by which point they will be offering exclusively an electric lineup. So you're seeing big, even American auto manufacturers, talking about 2034. We're talking 13 years from now. what does the next 20 years or so look like to you? And if we can really look into your crystal ball into the future, when do we start the remediation of turning around and improving the soil on all the locations that used to have gas stations? Can you take us into the future through your eyes?
Oh, that's a hard question because there's lots of different ways that this could go. But I do think that the automakers have seen the writing on the wall that electric vehicles will eventually be cheaper to own and operate, cleaner to own and operate, and more fun to drive. And they are making big investments to transition their fleet. Now, whether it's going to be 2035 or 2028 or 2039, it's not too far away. It's not next year. And so we're still pushing, and we still need policy to push this transition forward until we get to some critical mass. I'd like to see more automakers make this pledge and actually put steel in the ground to build the factories to make it work. You mentioned the second part, which is all these petrol stations, gas stations that we have around North America that have underground storage tanks that often leak. We've been remediating these in environmental engineering for a long time. Often the cost falls to local communities or to the government if the gas station went bankrupt or left town. There are big opportunities to remediate some of these industrial sites, not just gas stations, but other things where historical pollution has been, historical inequities have been, to redevelop these safely for the community's benefit.
So, when it comes to fleets, you mentioned fleets. That's such a huge part of, I think of when I know that, for example, ATCO, which is like a power provider out here. I happen to know because my buddy works for them. They got the Dodge Ram fleet, the whole Ram fleet. Do you see companies taking action here? Do you think that this is, as companies endeavor to so-called go green, and the cynic in me would invoke the phrase virtue signal, though I don't want to be cynical about it. But is this something where you think individuals and companies more take a stand trend-wise on moves toward sustainability, or do you see this more as a collective approach? How do you think that messaging gets massaged and put out there?
And Ryan, I think this comes from both ends. I think you might have a couple companies that are trying to greenwash a little bit and say, look at our fleet of sustainable pickup trucks. But then once they start driving at them and they look at their balance sheet at the end of the year, they're going to say, holy smokes, this is cheaper, right? I mean, so I think that there's going to be the economics for fleets makes a lot of sense. You know where they're parked every night, you know how to charge them, you know how far they're driving. And so fleets, I think, are going to be some of the first adopters of these types of vehicles as we go forward.
Can I ask you? I don't actually think it's a silly question. This is why I had an opportunity to drive. I was talking about this Jeep Wrangler, the 4xe. It's a really neat unit. You can switch it over whether you want it to run with sort of electrical support, like in a sort of a hybrid model, just on the dash, or you can switch it to fully electric, which I did, of course, because I wanted to see what the experience is like. Number one, as you alluded to, anybody that's driven an electric car knows there's some real zip to it. But what really almost weirded me out was how silent it is. And the first thing I thought of was safety issues. And I just think of as the father of a 5-year-old, we teach him to look both ways and then to look both ways again, that sort of a thing. Do you think that there could be safety issues around the silence of these vehicles and how people are accustomed to determining threats when it comes to oncoming cars, et cetera?
So the roads are dangerous right now, right? They're dangerous with gasoline vehicles. They're dangerous to crash. So we should have safe streets, full stop. They're also dangerous with the air pollution and the climate pollution coming out of tailpipes. Now, with quieter electric vehicles, some vehicles add a little bit of background noise under certain situations to alert pedestrians, to make sure that pedestrians are aware of their presence. But I think at a bigger level, when we think about a kind of a downtown urban center, and you start to notice all the noise that comes from big buses and cars, I think it's going to make life in communities a lot more pleasant when the humming of a big roaring engine is replaced by something more quiet.
Dr. Costa Samaras is a systems engineer, policy analyst, director of the Center for Engineering and Resilience for Climate Adaptation, the co-director of the Power Sector Carbon Index. a professor at Carnegie Mellon University. You must follow him on Twitter, and I've linked to his handle in the tweet that I put out every morning around 10 o'clock Eastern, 8 o'clock Mountain. Been looking forward to this for a long time. I look forward to speaking with you again. Thanks for this.
Thank you so much for having me on, Ryan. Very much appreciated.
You bet. Always curious to know, Real Talkers, obviously, how you feel about what you're hearing. This is from Doug, says, I see our family purchasing an electric vehicle, likely closer to the end of a decade. Donna says these are good ideas. Donna says my city was built on sort of the oil and gas thinking. Everybody should drive. Our infrastructure needs work. These are why I love the conversations around, with people like Brent Todderin or city planners, where you talk about what does intuitive city design look like in a predictive context. What will people's... Sarah, I thought that was interesting too, even with Costa, where he said, he talks about it not necessarily, he goes, I don't drive a truck. Then he goes, I walk or cycle everywhere. He talked about the electric bike being such a huge influence there. It's kind of funny. I'm the same way where not as him. I'm the way where I think everything in my mind revolves around the car. I have a bike. I love to walk every day. But at the same time, I think if we were looking for a new house, for example, something like that, one of the first things I would think of is like, what's the parking? Is there a garage? Like the mindset is around a car. I wonder if that attitude, I wonder if the psyche kind of changes. I wonder if people start to think more as someone that's always had a car in the driveway, if maybe they start thinking about, if I live a little more central, or if I live closer to my work, maybe I don't need one. Maybe I do a ride share. Maybe I do. I mean, I think the whole thing is changing.
I feel like you're being really optimistic.
Well, maybe.
But to me, it's bigger picture. And I mean, maybe it's chicken and egg. Like, well, if people live more centrally, then the cities will change in their structure. But I really feel that it's the streets and the sidewalks and ultimately the infrastructure that teaches people and tells people how to use it. So as our cities are continuing to be built for motor vehicles, we will continue to be focused on the motor vehicle. So to me, that's why I think this conversation is so exciting, is the fact that, it doesn't address the problem of us being car-centric, but it at least addresses the problem of emissions. So it's getting at it at a slightly different angle. I have to say, and this is not going to help my rep on the show, being the tree hugger that I am.
Quit trying to claim that territory for yourself.
You want in?
I've been an environmental advocate for years.
Okay, fair enough.
But you are a bigger tree hugger.
Oh, thank you, Sam. He brought up the photo of me hugging Sherry.
There's Cherry Sherry the cherry tree in her early days, her in-studio days.
Now she's in my yard. And
how's she taking, by the way, not to get off track?
She's great.
She's thriving?
She's beautiful.
She's happy?
Yeah, she's great. So, but I have an electric vehicle, and I can attest to the fact of like that, what you were talking about, the instantaneous pick up and go. You go. And the other thing that I love is I do charge at home. It's fantastic. I basically park it. I also plug it in here at work sometimes too.
I noticed that.
Yeah. So to me, it's like, when I'm not driving it, which is most of the time, I can plug it in.
Are they gonna be charging that back to us?
It's like plugging in a toaster.
I guess it can, that can come with the perks of working at Real Talk, is you can plug your EV into the, boy, we're going to sound so woke. We're going to sound so impressive.
It's not like it's those mega like Uber Duber charging stations. It's literally have an adapter, so you just plug it into a plug-in. Mm-hmm. So it's like a toaster. It's not having any like crazy draw.
I love knowing that Real Talk is on in my mechanic's shop, and Wayne and Barry and Scotty and the fellas are watching live. Appreciate that. Wayne says, I am absolutely going to invent a sound system for electric cars that will enable you to program any gas or diesel engine exhaust sound and play it out of speakers that look like tailpipes. This is actually a brilliant idea.
Yeah, patent that.
If you actually can make them like pop and have the odd flame, Wayne, you know exactly what I'm like, just the odd, like a controlled backfire. He says it would be tied into your throttle, so it could vary with throttle position. He says, hell, you could play music out of the tailpipe if you want. He says, imagine your Tesla sounding like a Ferrari or a tractor or anything you want.
I love that idea because, yes, they are very quiet. I have to make sure I need to be more aware, which is not a bad thing, that it's quiet so I can sneak up on people if I'm not.
That's the one thing that makes me nervous.
But it's like, as a driver, you should be paying attention.
Yeah, but not everybody is. Like, you know what? I'm actually, I'm not even totally joking. But I'm really eager for the day when the self-driving car is a thing, because I've come to the point where I don't trust about 80% of the people on the road. I've always despised, what do they call them? Like undivided highways, right? Like the only thing between you and the car coming at you at 120 is a painted yellow line. And I'm not a nervous driver. Ask anybody that's ridden with me, they'd probably say the opposite. But every time I just kind of till the car goes past, and I don't know if that person's checking their phone, or I don't know if that person's had like 6 rum and cokes, or I don't know. I get nervous, and I long for the day when the self-driving technology can just computers can be smarter than us. People can sleep or do whatever they want while they're on the road. I don't think it's that far away. I don't know. I envision these whole new eras, and then you think of, hey man, like I have 1 million songs on my phone right now, or whatever I want. I have access to whatever information. Like, just think of where we were 10 years ago to where we are now. 10 years from now, mind blown.
Have you seen Terminator when the robots take over?
Oh, jeez.
Come on.
Here we go. Sam, you and I are a little bit more, I won't speak on your behalf, but we're a little bit more sentimental when it comes to the vehicles we drive. There's a story attached to the vehicles we drive.
Oh, I love my 83 Riviera.
You got to see your 83 Riviera. Do they call it a cabriolet, or do they call it a soft top? What do they?
I call it a rag top.
A rag top. Your Riviera rag top. That's I guess maybe a guy like you could invest your pennies into turning that into an EV.
It would be fun to electrify, and I say this because, it's got the 307 V8 in it, which is not the right engine, because the Riviera convertible was GM's biggest mistake and biggest wonderful achievement. But we're not going to go down that road.
It's like driving an AMC Pacer.
No, one thing
that means nothing to me. I don't it's like blah blah blah.
The AMC Pacer, like the Wayne's World car.
Oh,
it looks like the fishbowl.
Got it.
It's not necessarily regarded or remembered as one of the greatest automotive achievements of all time. You might also group it in with the Ford Pinto, sort of. The Ford. Well, read up about the Pinto. Read what happens when you get rear-ended driving a Ford Pinto. It's no bueno. No, things get hot in a hurry, so to speak.
I guess where I was going with this is I don't think classic cars are going away, and I think they're going to still be here, and I think they're going to be fun to pull out, and they're going to be fun to drive. And I think that, probably motorsports will kind of become the realm of performance driving, where you just sort of go out. I think that there will probably be an era where there's more sort of recreational driving for kind of that nostalgic aspect.
Yeah.
And it becomes a bit more of an activity. I mean, I would trade driving my car to work every day for taking a bus to work if I could then just rev it up on the highway and go for road trips. You know what I mean?
But none of this,
it's just a lifestyle
But
change.
none of this precludes the advent of electric vehicles.
No, not one bit.
Right? It's
that's already, all of that stuff is already happening.
All of that's possible. And if you want to talk about performance, I mean, I've been lucky enough to ride in a couple pals' Teslas that are like slam you back in your seat. They're 0 to 60 miles an hour, 0 to 100 kilometers an hour in less than 3 seconds. That's like street bike fast.
And no oil changes ever again.
Yeah, but then you spill coffee on the computer, and then it's like 18 grand. So you save money on the oil change. But I'm not trying to be the cynic. I'm just trying to be the realist. If I had 5 cents for every time I said that. I'm curious to know where real talkers are out on this. I do agree with Love Ice TV, who says if you're enjoying the show today, smash the like button. We appreciate everybody that does that. It helps us on the the algorithm. I know so much about algorithms.
Those robots again. The robots are taking over.
Hey, when the robots start perfectly toasting croissants for me and spreading them with just the right amount of raspberry jam, maybe some fresh squeezed OJ, I'm in. I'm in for the advent of the robots. As long as there's just got to be sort of the fail safe, right? Where you just got to be able to sort of unplug them or hit the thing or the jamming. You got to have a remote that can jam the signal.
That's
Humans always.
You got to watch Terminator because they're too smart. They'll figure out how to make so you can't unplug them.
Troy says instead of digital tailpipes, why not just set it to scream, "I have no personality or talent, yet I crave attention." Troy, I've got all the time in the world for these types of conversations. I understand why some people say like, there's nothing more annoying, and I'm in my neighborhood, and then Harley guy pulls out, just, you know. And then I also, when I think of Harley guy, I go, oh, like I'm the guy that sort of loves that stuff. So, and I understand people can judge me for that. That's fine. But I know Hoyles is just looking at me like seething. But for me, if I'm on a patio. And I'm, by the way, stage one, our home province, Alberta, kind of reopening today. Interesting. So you can be able to hit your favorite patio today. Everybody be smart. Everybody get vaccinated, get those second shots, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it's an interesting day. It's a day of note. It's worth mentioning. But I don't mind if I'm on a patio and about to have a sip of my white wine sangria. And I'm jolted and I spill a little bit because Harley guy just ripped past and just gave it some throttle. Like I'm like,
that's
yeah,
the worst.
No, I got time for that. I that's part of it. And all the people that are complaining about all that noise. I mean, a neighborhood's a little bit different, but all the people that live downtown. Oh, I live on, I don't want to be, I live on Robson Street in Vancouver, and I'm sick of all the noise. Like, what did you think you were getting into?
Yeah, if you're living on Bloor,
what are you doing living?
You know that in Toronto, that. You're going to get
signed up to live there. I live downtown. I'm so sick of all the noise. And well, all right.
Yeah, but there's noise and then there's noise. There's the normal sort of city traffic noise, and then there's the idiot that has his motor running at the highest decibel level that it can possibly be.
Enthusiast.
Okay.
There's the enthusiast. There's the enthusiast that's just kissing the red line, just kissing it, just blowing off those turbos. And no, I think that there's a happy medium.
I just love how there were those decibel monitors put up in the city, and then everyone's like, "Oh, so you want us to test out?"
Worst idea of all time. To bring people up to speed. The city of Edmonton with a pilot project, I think it was last summer, right? And they put up these dB meters around the city, like a sort of like if you hit like a certain amount of whatever it was, 85 decibels or 90 decibels, you can get a ticket. And then they put up metering monitors on the side of the road with digital readouts. What do you think is going to happen? You put a speed gun in front of anybody. They're going to try to see how fast they can throw a baseball or how fast they can run. Well, I wouldn't do that now. It'd be humiliating.
They would, and then they unplugged them like within a couple of days. They're like,
yeah.
Whoops.
That was to me the first minute I saw it. When I knew it was going to be a problem, when the first thing I did was stomp on it. I was driving a car that had a little jam at that time. Not anymore. Nothing but responsibility over here. The family man. That's why I'm happy to let families across Alberta know that today, literally this morning, the team at Friesen Brothers is opening its 16th Alberta location. That's right. You're going, wait a second, Ryan, you mean 15, right? The South Edmonton one? No! This is an amazing story, and I don't know too much about it. I'll have more details in the days to come, but literally yesterday, Friesen Brothers took over the grocery store in Sundre, Alberta. Shout out to everybody in Sundre. They turned it around. Their team is turning around overnight, and it's opening this morning as a Friesen Brothers. Now, over the days to come, you're going to start to see all of those magical elements, all the beautiful things that we tell you that comes with a Friesen Brothers. But Sundre, congratulations. You are location number 16. Friesen Brothers has been proudly Alberta-grown, Alberta-owned for more than 65 years. Keep an eye out for the Father's Day barbecue gift box that's coming up in Edmonton, Fort Saskatchewan, and Stony Plains stores, similar to the Mother's Day gift box, and we'll keep you posted when it comes to details there. Our friends at the Dairy Queens of Northwest Edmonton and Sherwood Park. I know a lot of you are tuned in for this because you're going, it's June 1st, and the May special was the Peanut Butter Parfait for $1.99, which is a wild price drop. That's the one with, of course, the creamy, soft serve and the hot. Oh, I blew it. Oh, I blew it.
Boo. Boo.
I went to go hot rich fudge, but of course it's rich hot. Hot rich fudge does not flow.
Come on, Jesperson.
Why did I do that?
Jesperson.
Oh, the studio audience, absolutely no tolerance, nor should you. Hold me to a higher standard when I get to the rich, hot fudge. And so the team of the Dairy Queens of Northwest Edmonton and Sherwood Park reached out and said, real talkers, they said they're a bit of an interesting breed. I said, tell me something I don't know. They said, no, they're going like nuts. You see what I did there? Nuts over the Peanut Buster Parfait. So we're going to extend it for one more week. Yeah, that's right. You have one more week to load up on Peanut Buster Parfaits. They're 2 for $4.20 at the Dairy Queens of Northwest Edmonton and Sherwood Park. Also, a big shout out to the team at Westworld Computers. For more than 40 years, you know their deal. They've been family owned, bringing you the best that the Mac Apple lineup has to offer. Here's the thing, though. It also means that their service techs have more than 40 years experience fixing it all. Book your appointment today via westworld.ca. Get your equipment running in tip-top shape again. And if you decide to upgrade, keep in mind, they'll swap over all your data for free at Westworld Computers at westworld.ca. In about 10 minutes, we're going to talk to the leader of Canada's federal New Democratic Party. Jagmeet Singh will be making his Real Talk debut. It's part of an ongoing series where we will endeavor to speak with the leader of every federal political party. We've already spoken, as you know, with the Right Honourable Justin Trudeau. We're going to be talking to Annamie Paul, the leader of Canada's Green Party, coming up in, what is that, Sarah, about just over a week from now. Isn't that right?
Yeah, June 9th.
June 9th.
The Wednesday of next week.
Annamie Paul, I'm looking forward to that because, I mean, the Green Party to me is always is a fascinating one, right? Like, what direction does it go in? What perceptions do Canadians have about what the Green Party is all about? Where might it find alignment with other political parties? And then even just within the party, how does it, I mean, when you think of the Green Party in Canada, you think of Elizabeth May. For years.
100%.
Right?
Always Elizabeth May. She was the Green Party for a long time. And now, I mean, they've built momentum and now new leader.
So what does it look like under Annamie Paul? We'll find out. Of course, we're going to also reach out to the leaders of Canada's Bloc Québécois and, of course, the Conservative Party of Canada. And we look forward to speaking. We hope to speak with each one of those party leaders. The federal NDP saw a storyline develop. This was really before, I mean, it's all relatively speaking, but before the real, the violence in the Middle East, before it really started making international headlines, before it became unignorable in Canada, in the United States, in Western Europe, the federal NDP were talking about it. And we're going to get into that with Jagmeet Singh coming up in about 10 minutes. The reason why I bring that up right now is because we asked you last week as part of our question of the week, which is presented by our official research and strategy partners at Y Station. We asked you about the violence in the Middle East. We asked you how you're feeling about it. We asked you to be candid with us. We recognize that it's difficult subject matter. It can be very polarizing subject matter. And it showed. When it even came to the responses to our surveys, I'm going to point out the obvious. Our Patreon supporters, those that have made a monthly commitment to the show via RyanJesperson.com, we appreciate that so very much. They receive our top line report exclusively. This top line report, 19 pages of data to go through. But one of the things that we noticed very quickly in the report is we received just about half of the regular number of completed surveys. Typically, we'll see about 1,000 surveys completed. We've seen it as high as 2,000. Our record, right around Aloha Gate back in January, 4,500 of you completed our survey and chimed in. This one, not so much. 543 surveys completed. Still a decent sample size. Gives us a pretty clear idea of how a good number of you feel about this issue, but it had me wondering why. I wonder if maybe people just kind of wanted to stay away from this one, or maybe people didn't feel strongly that they had maybe the awareness or the understanding to really chime in and to make a contribution to the question. I don't know, but that was one of the first things I noticed. 543 surveys completed. This is a note from Chris Henderson, who he, along with his team, they go through this and they compile these top-line reports. He said this was a tricky one. People were pretty real with us on this, but he says, we really did try to capture a diversity of opinions in the comments that we included. That said, the respondents of this particular survey favored the Palestinian side of this conflict. He says that's just the math. So let's get to some of the highlights, so to speak. Here are some of the more notable statistics when it came to the questions that we asked you. 19% of Real Talkers, 19% of those that responded to this survey said that their opinion had changed because of recent violence in the Middle East. 2% say that they have swayed toward a position of more supportive of Israel. 17%, nearly 1 in 5, said that their position has changed because of the conflict toward a more supportive position when it comes to the Palestinians involved. An interesting statistic. Here's another one. 61% of audience members felt their opinion had not changed on the matter since the start of the conflict. 6 out of 10, the opinion has not changed, while about the same number, 60% of listeners, and this one, tough to hear, understandable, felt that a lasting peace between Israel and Palestine simply is not possible. That was one that I don't know if it was surprising. I thought it was notable. 60% do not believe in the possibility of so-called peace in the Middle East. We asked, how much did you feel that you knew about the situation in Israel and Palestine prior to this conflict flaring up in early to mid-May, earlier this month? About 55% of you said that you were informed enough to have an opinion on the matter, 55%. 31% said you felt like you were informed, but not enough to form an opinion. Just 12% said, I wasn't really paying much attention. And how about this 3% said, I would not consider myself to be informed, but I still have an opinion on it. We asked if you know more about the politics of the region than you did at the beginning of May. 40% said, yes, you've learned more. 25% said maybe, but the situation seems so complicated, I don't know if I know enough. That's where I'd be. 23% said I knew a lot before. This conflict has just underlined what I already knew. We asked you, what factors do you think played a role in changing your mind or influencing your view over the past number of weeks? Almost 60%, 59% of respondents said that news stories from traditional sources like TV, newspaper, radio, obviously podcasts, went a long way. 53% said social media posts chronicling the events in detail factored in. Relatively few felt that remarks from elected officials had factored into your awareness or your learning around this subject. Just 16% attributed remarks from elected officials around the world when it comes to impacting your position or your view on Israel and Palestine. John Oliver, a bit of a shout out here for his comments on the situation. Remarks from columnists or program hosts, 43% of you said that went a long way. Not insignificant. We asked about the factors impacting your position and view on Israel and Palestine. One of our audience members said learning about Hamas, watching anti-Semitic hate spread around the world has made it much easier to choose a side. Israel is not perfect, but Israel is attacking terrorists. Hamas is targeting civilians. That's one opinion. Another says, my own research has informed me the most. Multiple reputable sources, NPR, peer-reviewed papers. Another says, I see this more and more as people fighting for survival. Israel wants to exist, so does Palestine. Another says, I've been learning more about Israel's colonialism of Palestine. Another says, new friends of ours who live in Jordan, surrounding areas, have been in touch, informing us, as well as the podcast Pod Save America. We've had guests from Pod Save America on Real Talk before, you'll remember. Others said, one said, I don't really understand why people are so staunchly in support of Israel. If that could be explained to me, maybe that would help inform my opinion. Another said, I do not think it's my place to have a voice for either side. What I do wish is that it can be resolved. I do not understand why our world in this age is still stuck here. Sarah Hoyles looks intrigued by that one. I feel like I'm throwing you a hot potato, but I know you can handle it.
It's very hot potato.
Of all of the comments I made, what was it about that one that resonated with you?
Well, I would just say not picking. Well, there's always that really contentious piece around like both sides, like what are both sides of this? And I think, as most of the comments talked about, very nuanced, it's very complex, and why we're still stuck here, I think, is what really stood out to me. And I guess it's because of the nuances, because of the complexity, that solutions have not been found. And yeah, the two-state solution, you know, saying that there needs to be Palestine, there needs to be Israel. There's just, they can't seem to agree on what that looks like. How would that actually look? So, I mean, I'm not an expert. I guess I'm just the climate that we're in, not weather-wise, but just the climate that we're in, and seeing what it's like, how land and who gets to take up space, and what land is whose land. I mean, Canada, we're dealing with that right now, and looking at the genocide that took place so Canada could exist. That's we have a history to reckon with, and a present to reckon with. And to me, I feel like now, just all the statements around like, this is nothing new, this isn't anything that's happened that's just started. This is what's just started, is white folk are becoming aware.
When you signed up to work here, did you anticipate you'd be moving from, I mean, it's literally like, I don't mean to use the word heavy disrespectfully. As a matter of fact, I want to use it respectfully and intentionally. It some days it's heaviness to heaviness to heaviness, right? Meaningful, right? Understanding, conversation, openness, candor. These are all the things that we commit to every day on the show, and that our audience commits to as well, showing up. I mean, people show up every single day to have these conversations. An audience member said, I really appreciate hearing things from different sides that aren't extremist with regards to where this is rooted, hearing from people who don't perceive the same conflict or the same sources, yet are living with the consequences. These are the voices that people need to hear to truly understand. I really appreciate that comment. Another says, this will never go away. These are two factions too entrenched in their way of thinking. This will go on forever. Another says, I believed in a two-state solution, but I felt that the only option now is a one-state solution that affords equal rights to Palestinians, to Israelis. Another says, I believe a two-state solution is possible, but only if the United States of America stops providing unconditional support to Israel. That's a big one. President Joe Biden's got, I mean, there's a good number of prominent Democrats that are speaking out. Is Jagmeet Singh ready to rock? We're going to get to this with him in just a second. Of course, we'll lead closer to home, and we'll make our way there. I'm very much looking forward to the leader of Canada's NDP making his debut in just a moment. Let me quickly remind you that the team at Eden Landscaping right now has shovels in the ground, literally multiple work crews that are out turning your dream into reality. It's what they've spent their winter and spring doing, is talking to their partners, their customers, their clients that have envisioned that outdoor patio, the kitchen, maybe that new retaining wall, and the veggie planting boxes that could go along next to it. Whatever your dream, they can build it. They've been doing it for more than 20 years, and difficult challenges, solutions. I mean, this is what they're all about. Mike says, send us your problems and we'll solve them at landscapeedmonton.ca. That's where you'll find Eden Landscaping. Also, hey, today, June 1st, today is the beginning of this Canadian Rural and Remote Housing and Homelessness Symposium. This is your last opportunity to get in. It's today, tomorrow, and June 3rd. The Rural Development Network, the Rural Ontario Institute, they're going virtual. Obviously, a unique program, more than 30 workshops, panel sessions, keynote speakers like Indigenous activist Jesse Thistle's there. You can learn more on collaborating with housing providers, community leaders, social innovators, all in the theme of rural across Canada. If you use the code Ryan, today's the last day, you can use the code Ryan to get 20% off. That's an exclusive offer for Real Talkers at crrhh.ca. That's CRRHH.ca. hh.ca. He's a lawyer. He's a human rights activist. He's an MP out of BC. He's the leader of Canada's new Democratic Party, making his Real Talk debut. It's a pleasure to welcome to the show Jagmeet Singh. Welcome, and thanks for making time for us today.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Every Canadian, I think, is right now trying to understand at a personal level and then to broaden their understanding of what a meaningful response to the horrific discovery of 215 young bodies outside a former residential school in Kamloops. We'll talk about the position that your party took in just a moment, but you personally, as a human being, how are you processing it?
Yeah, it was very tough to imagine what that's like for the families. I was really trying to put myself in the position of a family member, a mom or a dad, whose kids were first stripped away from them, forcibly removed from them when they were forced to go to this institution, and stripped of their identity, of their language, of their home, of who they are. And then these children were killed. And I was trying to really think about, if you've got a school, like a primary school, would there ever be 215 kids that die at a school? I remember growing up, I don't remember ever having any kid lose their life in any of my classes all through elementary school and high school. So to have 215 kids die, I mean, those aren't kids that are dying. Those are kids that were killed, whether it was negligence or purposeful. Like, these are kids that were killed. And what that means for a family that never knew, that never got the closure of knowing whatever happened to their baby. It is horrible. And the whole country, every single person is really feeling this and grieving this. And it really just highlights a couple of key things. One is, we've got to acknowledge the genocide, the horrible, traumatic impact that people coming to this country have had on the first people of this land. And it should motivate us all that it is not enough for the Liberal government or any government to do any sort of symbolic gesture to grieve. We need concrete action for justice. So some of the things we've called for is stopping taking or fighting Indigenous kids in court. Right now, Justin Trudeau is fighting Indigenous kids in court. Stop fighting survivors in court, which is also happening. And really commit to helping any community that wants to investigate institutions in their communities to see if there are other mass graves like this. We need to help in the healing process. We need to acknowledge the harms done, and we really need to commit to justice.
When you talk about fighting Indigenous children in court, when you talk about fighting survivors in court, let's take those on separately. Children first. What do you believe that what position should the federal government take, or what strategy should the federal government employ here? Let's get specific.
Sure. So the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, a very reputable body. This is the Institute for Human Rights in Canada. The Canadian Human Rights Tribunal has on multiple occasions found that Indigenous kids were underfunded and has made a recommendation based on that underfunding that the Canadian government should actually pay a remuneration for that. The Canadian government, instead of accepting the finding of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, and again, this is not just some small organization that says, oh, there's some injustice here. This is the body. This is the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. They're saying that this has to be done. The Canadian government has ignored the ruling multiple times and is now fighting that ruling in court. That to me is wrong. These are kids that we found in a mass grave because of the injustice of a system, of an institution. And now the government is fighting kids despite a ruling that says that they were underfunded. Why would the government fight them? I would, if I was Prime Minister, accept the ruling, the 4 rulings of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, and start the path of reconciliation by following through on what they've ordered Canada to do.
When it comes to fighting survivors, how would you change the approach, or how would you shape the approach of the federal government were you to form government?
So right now, similarly, we have survivors that are brought forward a claim that are survivors of residential schools. And instead of accepting that, yes, clearly the survivors of these schools have trauma, have pain and that trauma needs to be addressed, the federal government's fighting them in court and saying, no, we're not going to compensate you. We're not going to recognize the harm you've suffered. Again, I would not take that approach. I would take the approach as prime minister. Of course, we have to do our part to remedy that horrible injustice. We have to do our part. And I would be actively finding ways to address those claims. Instead of fighting them in court, I would be working to respond to their claims.
How do you think that this will, I don't mean the question to come across as gauche, and I hope it doesn't, but how do you think that this discovery in Kamloops will shape political dialogue and political direction over the next year to 2 years? I mean, is this people Canadians at a ground level, Canadians at an individual and at community levels are feeling this deeply? Perhaps you could give us some insight into how you think that this will influence the halls of Parliament, the halls of power, so to speak.
Well, I think that people are feeling this really personally. We see memorials happening across the country. People are leaving baby shoes, children's shoes to commemorate the loss of those young lives. And I think that is very powerful and very important. That grieving process, elders are conducting sacred ceremonies to guide the spirits of these children that were stripped from their homes. Very important, very powerful. But the federal government and federal leaders can't just give words of condolence. That is just not good enough. Right now, the Prime Minister of Canada can't just say, I'm sorry about this. He has to do something concrete. And that's why I've been calling for that concrete justice. And I'm hoping that this is a moment that people also agree that, you know what, that's right. Performative actions, symbolic gestures, words aren't good enough. We need to see real action. Like, this is a painful thing. This is a painful and horrible, horrible discovery. It's horrific. And in light of that, what can we do to honor those lives? We can fight for justice. And what does justice look like? Well, it certainly means not taking kids to court. It certainly means not denying survivors their claims. It certainly means working in partnership with Indigenous communities to uncover any additional sites. And it means walking the path of reconciliation by implementing the TRC's calls to action. Many of those calls to action actually speak directly about this, about the survivors of these schools. And I feel really weird calling them schools. I mean, it is very 1940-esque. 1984-esque, like George Orwellian, to call a place that was clearly designed to kill kids a school. Like, that's not what it was. These are institutions that were designed very openly, by one of the architects to kill the Indian and the child. That was what they were designed to do. And so we should probably figure out a better term for these places that were designed to eradicate and eliminate Indigenous people. But yeah, given how horrible this is, I'm hoping that the next step is no more words and symbolic gestures, but concrete actions. And we've laid out some of those.
You've called for the government to fund an investigation of other residential school sites. We had a fascinating conversation just earlier on this broadcast with a Métis archaeologist who noted the need to consult with communities, with Indigenous communities, and to approach it on a case-by-case basis, so to speak. 139 former residential schools across the country. People will rightfully, I think, question any politician's real commitment to this, considering the fact that we're examining our entire nation's response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, to the steps, the dozens of steps that virtually to this point have been ignored. We note that there can, several reserves remain under boil water advisories. We recognize that there are still very many challenges, death by suicide, the rates are disproportionate in so many Indigenous communities. The mental health resource, the deficiencies are evident and are abhorrent. Why should the average Canadian believe the average politician or anything they say about this right now?
Well, so far, it's been a pretty dismal failure. There's no question about it. People are right to be frustrated. Indigenous people are frustrated and angry because they've been told again and again certain things would happen that didn't happen. I can think about most recently the clean water commitment. Justin Trudeau made that commitment, said he's going to make sure that everyone has access to clean drinking water, and broke that promise and announced it this year that we're breaking our promise. We're unable to do that. I don't buy it that in a country as wealthy as ours, we're a G7 nation, meaning we're one of the world's largest economies. In the 21st century, it's the year 2021. I do not accept that we can't make sure every Indigenous community in this country has clean drinking water. I don't accept it. I don't accept that if we put our resources towards this, we could not achieve this goal. So I believe it's really just been a question of priority and political will, that previously parties have just gotten by on saying things and not doing things. And that has to end. We've got the power, the capacity, the technology, the economy that gives us the ability to make real changes that would bring in justice. And I believe we cannot settle for anything less than that.
I've got a whole bunch of questions I want to ask you about Canada's post-pandemic economic recovery. One of the issues, certainly, that the pandemic has put forefront in Canadian minds is how we treat our elderly, our senior citizens, including long-term care facilities. Why have you called for the federal government to no longer permit for-profit long-term care? And are you concerned about the ripples that would inevitably send through that industry?
I'm not concerned about the ripples. I'm willing to take on anyone that I need to bring in better treatment of our seniors, of people. So I'm always ready to take on the fight. And the reality is, I actually did an announcement in Edmonton not too long ago, a couple of weeks ago, where Parkland Institute, which is an organization out of Alberta, released a report that really laid out very clearly that for-profit long-term care homes had the worst hours of care, the worst staffing levels, and it directly meant that seniors are worse off. That meant that when profit was put first, when profit was the motive of a long-term care home, it meant there was less care provided to our seniors and our loved ones, and less care meant they were more likely to get sick and more likely to die. That is the evidence. The evidence is overwhelming. For profit, what's not a surprise, when you've got a profit motive in long-term care or frankly anywhere, for-profit motives meant that care was cut, the quality of care was cut, and it meant seniors are worse off. And so I've been saying at the federal level, this is the exact same challenge that we had with private hospitals. And there was a time when there were private hospitals across Canada. We brought in the Canada Health Act and believed very strongly in bringing in public care where people were put first, not profits. Every cent should go towards the care of the patients, and money should not be going towards the bottom line to giving shareholders dividends, to increasing profits. Money should be reinvested in care. And that's what we need to do. We should start with Revera, which is the second largest provider in Canada, and it is owned entirely by a federal agency. We can start by making that public, and we can continue to use the tools we have to build a system where seniors, our loved ones, are put first, their care is put first, and it is not about making profit.
Let me ask you this candidly, Mr. Singh. obviously it's no secret to you, detractors of those that would criticize your political approach or the approach of your party will brand you as socialists. They'll and perhaps you would accept that brand. I don't know. But they'll indicate that this is one example of exactly what you want to do. You believe that everything should be state owned and controlled. This is going to be an attack on private industry. Canada's economic recovery will require stability and investor confidence, and the approach that you would ideologically take could impact, in other words, in a detrimental fashion, the confidence of investors and the stability of Canada's recovery. What would be your message to those people?
When we're talking about long-term care, when we're talking about the care of our seniors, given the overwhelming evidence that makes it very clear that for-profit care has hurt seniors, I want to disrupt any confidence in the for-profit sector that they think they can continue to go on and exploiting our seniors. I want them to think twice about that. I don't want a for-profit sector that's going to exploit seniors to continue. Now, that's very different from other products. That's very different from other industries. When we're talking about the care of our seniors, it's not ideological. For me, it's evidentiary. And it's not my evidence. It's the evidence that it's overwhelmingly available. The military came into Ontario and Quebec. We got to be very clear about this. And they found unequivocally in the for-profit centers, syringes were being reused on different seniors. They found that expired medication was being used. This is what happens when profit is the motive in the care of vulnerable people. Absolutely, I'm opposed to profit off the backs of seniors and those who are vulnerable in long-term care. Now, there are many sectors that are private in our country and should continue to be and able to continue to prosper without a doubt. But it is very different when we're talking about the care of vulnerable people in long-term care, where the evidence is overwhelmingly pointed out that they are worse off, they are less cared for when it is in a for-profit system.
So how would you as Prime Minister make that determination of an industry or a sector that demanded more government involvement or government oversight or government control, public control if you want to call it, versus one that should be left alone? How would you draw the line or discern between the two?
Healthcare, all healthcare should be public because it should be about people getting the best quality care, and it shouldn't be about trying to make profit. When you think about it this way, if we're putting money into healthcare, we send money to long-term care homes. Would you rather that every cent of your money went towards the care of a senior in long-term care, or would you feel comfortable knowing that if you sent $1 to a for-profit long-term care home, some of that dollar is going to end up in the pockets of shareholders. Some of that dollar is going to go towards profit. I would rather every single dollar of money spent on the care of seniors in long-term care, I would want every single dollar going to good quality food, good quality staffing, nurses, doctors, personal support workers. And I think most Canadians would agree. When it comes to our seniors, you don't want any of that money that we're spending, our taxpayer dollars, shouldn't go to line the pockets of rich executives, shouldn't go to line the pockets of shareholders. If we're spending money on long-term care, it should all go to long-term care. So healthcare is one that should remain in public hands so that it's about public interest and people's interest. Things that we rely on are water. Imagine water was for profit. Imagine companies could jack up the price of water and charge us whatever they wanted to make more profit off of our water. There's certain things that are public goods that we want to keep in our hands. We want to control. The people should control our water. We should control our public necessities like our electricity. That should be in the hands of people. And we've seen evidence where things are public needs, like we need to keep our homes with electricity. We need to make sure we got water. We've seen examples around the world when you make those private, what happens is companies jack up the prices and it hurts people. It doesn't make it better for people. It makes it worse for people.
You've identified housing as an issue that demands attention, and you've noted, you've put numbers in front of Canadians. You'd like to see 500,000 homes built across the country over the next 10 years. You'd also like to see a 20% tax imposed on foreign buyers. How would that work? And if I may, what gives you the sense that what works in downtown Vancouver or in Burnaby makes sense in Saskatoon or Thunder Bay?
Well, a couple of things that we've seen that are going on. The housing crisis is devastating. We are in a horrible situation when it comes to housing. We know that people cannot find a place to call home. And this isn't just something that's impacting people with low income or no income. There's a housing homelessness crisis, which is real, but it's also a crisis for a young professional that earns a good salary. And that's happening across the country. The unifying number one issue that I was hearing before the pandemic hit, when I was traveling across the country, was the fact that housing was becoming more and more difficult for people to find. They could not find a home. They couldn't find a place to call home. So this is a real crisis. So some of the solutions are going to have to be regional for sure, but there's some things that we know are happening. One is speculation. We know that there are folks that look at the Canadian housing market and say, this is a very stable, great investment. Let's put our money here. And when BC brought in a foreign buyers tax, a lot of it actually started helping to cool the market and to bring down some of the pressures of speculation. Then those foreign investors started looking to other jurisdictions, saying, "Okay, maybe we can make money here in BC." They started looking to make money in other jurisdictions. So we know that that's one key thing that we can do. Money laundering is also being used to jack up the prices of housing, and it's something that's happening across the country. But what we want to also do is look at speculation that's happening in Canada, domestic speculation. People are flipping homes, and it's making it harder and harder for people to own a home. We want to tackle that. But finally, one of the key solutions we have is what happened after the World Wars is Canada made a decision to invest in building homes. A lot of the homes that people first bought after those World Wars were post-World War homes. They were affordable, quality, basic homes. We want to see a massive investment as a job creator and also a way to create homes for people. And so we want to see a massive injection into cooperative housing, not-for-profit housing, and just straight up federally funded homes that people can buy as their first home so that people can actually have a place to call home.
I want to talk to you about cooperation with the provinces, because I know that in past you've talked about a national pharmacare program. I know that you endeavor to further the discussion on tuition free, or let me just call it free post-secondary education. Of course, that would require the cooperation of the provinces. We've already seen some provinces like Alberta, and I think to a certain degree Ontario, say no thanks to a national pharmacare program. I suspect that there may be a similar response to things like a universal basic income. How much of a priority are these specifics, UBI, pharmacare, free tuition, so to speak, post-secondary, and how would you bring the provinces on board?
Well, I really appreciate the question and the opportunity to talk about this. So I'll start with pharmacare. Pharmacare, really what it comes down to is provinces and the federal government and different hospitals. We already are purchasing medication. So provinces spend money every year purchasing medication. The federal government spends money purchasing medication. We have a system where we've got all sorts of different buyers buying medication separately. If we pool that together, we would actually be able to negotiate better prices, and it would lower the cost for everyone. So I just believe the evidence has shown that is a better thing to do. It also doesn't make sense that in our healthcare system right now, you can go into a doctor, find out what's wrong with you, get prescribed a medication to keep you healthy, but not be able to afford it, not take it, and end up getting more and more sick and back into an emergency room, which costs a lot more. There's a reason why we're the only country in the world that has a universal healthcare system that doesn't also include medication coverage. So similar to what happened with the Canada Health Act, there were a lot of provinces that said no in the beginning. We started off with some provinces that agreed, and then eventually other provinces saw that this health accord actually was working, that getting people healthcare included as a part of our system worked. Ontario said no in the beginning. It was one of the last provinces to agree. Alberta didn't say yes right away in the past. That's the reality. But once we get it done, we know that Atlantic provinces are open to it. We know that Yukon has already said they're open to it. Once we get it started and you've got people in a province or a territory that have no issues getting their medication, it's going to be tough to sell that to your citizens in Alberta or Ontario saying, well, why are folks in the Atlantic provinces, why are folks in Yukon being able to get medication for free? It's included in their healthcare system. Why aren't we also doing it? I feel like that's the pressure that would mount, and we'd make the argument that it's going to be better. The more provinces that join in will just lower the cost for us, and it'll make a better system.
You're giving too much credit. You're giving too much credit to logic, though, in this scenario. There's a lack of logic when it comes to the relationship between some provinces, including Alberta, and the federal government. I don't have to tell you that. So the question is, how do you bring them on board, right? I mean, evidence, I guess, only goes so far, as much as it dismays me to say it. What about things like a UBI or tuition?
That's a really fair argument. I would just say I would look to history, not just logic, but the history has shown that initially people say no, provinces have said no, and over time they see the argument and they see that it works and they eventually come on board. So I would just not give up. UBI, what I would do with UBI is I would start with what we already have and expand it. So we know that we already have a form of basic income for seniors, whether it's the old age, the OAS or the GIS. We already provide income to seniors. It's just not enough to live with dignity. So I would start by, at the federal level, increasing the amount of support we give to seniors so it's enough to live with dignity. We've also proposed for people living with disabilities. There is a disability tax credit. There's some money that goes, but it's, again, not enough. So we proposed $2,200 a month to go to Canadians living with disabilities, to give them that dignity, to be able to live and to be able to contribute and to do to be able to live a life of dignity. And so we would start there, and then we could look at our other options. But those are two starting points. There are already forms of income support that exist. Let's just make those better and start and show that we can actually lift people out of poverty, give people dignity and respect, starting with our seniors and people living with disabilities.
Tuition, post-secondary tuition would be a huge commitment on behalf of both the federal government and the provinces. So where do you take the first bite out of that? How do you do it?
Well, the first bite that we proposed, we put forward a plan that we would forgive student debt. A lot of students are graduating with debt. And I give this analogy. When I went to law school, it was $8,000 a year. I went to one of the top law schools in Canada. It cost $8,000 a year. And though I got some grades, it wasn't that long ago that I went. But that same school now, that tuition is close to $30,000. That is not in any way keeping up with inflation. That is astronomical. So a student graduating from university now is dealing with levels of debt that we've not seen before. So what we're proposing is to help those students be able to buy their first home, to be able to get on their feet. We've gone beyond the one idea, which we continue to maintain, is to end interest payments on federal student debt. There should be no making of money off the backs of students. So ending interest payments or interest being charged on federal debt. And then what we can do at the federal level is there's lots of students that have federal debt. We would move to forgiving up to $20,000 for students, which would be a significant help and assistance to help them get back on their feet. So we'd start with that, but our ultimate goal is working towards, and it's going to take a lot of work and it's not going to be easy, but I'm ready to put in the work. We want to build a barrier-free education system where kids start in kindergarten and go up to any level of post-secondary, whether it's to get skilled trades or to become an engineer or whatever they want to pursue so they can contribute back. We want to see that be barrier-free, just the same way our kindergarten to grade 12 is barrier-free. Okay. That would be the ultimate dream. And a lot of countries have considered going down that path and have gone down a way to make it really accessible. I think we've got to invest in our young people, and that's one way to do it.
So the obvious question, the short question is, how do you pay for it? And let me ask you this with a bit of a preamble, and you'll have to refresh my memory. Honestly, I don't remember your current position here on, for example, like the LEAP manifesto. It's been a while since people have talked about that. There's been a lot of talk about a great reset. Do you see an opportunity? Do you see a window for completely transforming Canada's tax structure, the economy? People are talking about post-pandemic. This is the type of thing that's going to resonate. People will think before pandemic and after pandemic. How does that apply to you with things like how Canadians are taxed?
So on taxation, this is something that I've been really spending a lot of time thinking about. I know that a lot of people have lost their jobs in this pandemic. And even leading up to the pandemic, I know things have been really tough for the resource sector in Alberta, for example. So lots of workers have been struggling. Small businesses have been hard hit by the pandemic. So when I think about the question that people are asking, who pays for this pandemic, who pays for the recovery, and to your point, who pays for some of the programs we're talking about, it certainly shouldn't be the worker that lost his or her job. It shouldn't be the small business that was forced to shut down and may never open again. Well, who should it be? I say very clearly, it should be the 44 wealthiest billionaires in Canada who increased their wealth by $78 billion in this pandemic. It should be the Amazons of this world that didn't just make profit in the pandemic, but made record profit and to date pay virtually no tax in Canada, despite making profits off the backs of Canadians. The current tax system we have that Liberals and Conservatives have built basically advantages foreign companies like Amazon, Netflix, and Google. It allows them to make profits off of us, but pay virtually no taxes here. So I would end that. And France has shown some leadership and said, we can't figure out a way to tax through the corporate tax system because they don't have a corporate presence in France. They've taxed the revenue that they make in the country. I think that's an incredible idea. We need to make sure that companies that are making money off of Canadians pay their fair share, particularly these foreign companies that are making record profits. We need to close tax loopholes. Right now, it is completely legal for companies, and they do this regularly, to make profit off of Canadians, take that profit and put it into an offshore bank in the Caribbean and pay no taxes back into Canadians. I would end that. I would basically say the ultra rich should pay their fair share.
You know what the counterpoint's going to be, though. The counterpoint from people that would oppose your idea will simply be that you're going to chase away investment, that the NDP wants to chase away investment, that companies are not loyal to jurisdictions and they'll go wherever they're going to pay the least. And we hear it here in Alberta as opposed to tax rates across the rest of the country ad nauseum. You don't buy that?
I would say that companies are going to want to make profit. So it's not like if we say that Google's got to pay their fair share in Canada, Netflix has got to pay their fair share in Canada, Amazon's got to pay their fair share, that they're going to turn away profit. They're still going to make money. We're saying you're going to have to pay your fair share, though. You're not paying anything on that. You're making money off of companies. Why would we let a local company set up, a Canadian company that provides a service, whether it provides a streaming service, whether a Canadian company provides a service for you to do online purchases? That Canadian company has to pay its taxes in Canada. Why would we let Amazon get away with not paying their fair share? They absolutely should, and we can absolutely make sure that they continue to contribute their fair share, and they're going to operate in Canada. They're not going to turn away the profits here. So I don't buy that argument at all. And in fact, we're seeing in the States, one of our largest neighbor, in fact, they're actually looking at ways to make sure that the wealthiest pay their fair share. We've got to tax the ultra rich. There's no question about it. They've got to start contributing fairly. You or I don't use offshore tax havens to hide our income, but the wealthiest in Canada do. the ultra-rich do. That's got to end.
Let me ask you this in closing. Earlier this month, you called on the federal government to stop arms sales to Israel. We've been talking a lot on this program about the violent conflict in the Middle East. Your call came after about 80% of delegates, a significant number, endorsed a similar policy at your party's national convention in April. What does an appropriate involvement look like when it comes to Canada and the Middle East? Canada's relationship with Palestinians affected, Canada's relationship with Israel, and do you believe it to be a political boon or a political risk for your party to take this position federally?
Well, I did not take this position thinking that it would in any way be strategically advantageous. I just want to do my part as a global citizen to work towards peace. I really believe that, as human rights groups have said, to achieve peace, we need to apply pressure. And it really undermines our ability to promote peace when Canada is arming one side of the conflict. And that's why I took that position. We should not be arming Israel while Israel is violating international laws with the illegal occupation. But I want to be very clear. I believe Israel has the right to exist. And I believe that Israelis have the right to live with peace and security and safety. I believe that Palestinians have the right to exist, have the right to have a country, and have the right to live with peace and security. And so I denounce violence and the use of violence. I want to see peaceful resolution. I don't claim to have all the answers, but I do know we've got to play our part in encouraging and supporting the peace process. And it has to be more than words. We've seen in the past that you need to apply pressure to achieve our outcomes. And that's why I recommended one specific course of action to do our part to encourage a peaceful resolution.
He's the member of parliament out of Burnaby South, the leader of Canada's new Democratic Party. We appreciate your availability here on Real Talk, Mr. Singh. Thank you for this.
Thank you. My pleasure.
That's Jagmeet Singh, leader of the federal NDP. You can let me know what you think about that interview. We try to cover as much ground as we can with these party leaders. I mean, we could talk about taxation for half an hour. We could talk about post-secondary tuition for half an hour. We could talk about Canada's involvement in the Middle East for half an hour. Sometimes I like to go hot to the producer of this show. You're the one that booked the interview. And you're the one that'll be picking the highlight clip for the interview. What were the 30 seconds there? What were the 60 seconds that you went, ooh, interesting?
That is a tricky one.
You've had no time to reflect on it.
I'm just looking back at my notes. I mean, just the approach on residential schools, and that term just needs to get booted right out the window. That it does not actually articulate, it does not capture, it does not show the weight and gruesomeness that was inflicted on the kids there. And just that the statement around that schools, no, and I reflected on my own life. Jagmeet Singh was saying that no classmate of his ever died at school, and I can say, yeah, now that I think about it, no one died at my school.
I remember when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report came out, and one of the big things, like one of the very first things that the Prime Minister commented on publicly was using the word genocide. And I remember doing a series of radio interviews that morning and in the days following around the significance or the importance of the word genocide. And there was a lot of pushback from a lot of Canadians. This was not genocide. You should not call this genocide. I mean, you don't even really need to cherry pick here. It's all over the place. But one of the authors hand-selected to write Alberta's social studies curriculum, a fellow by the name of Chris Champion. This guy is behind an outlet called the Dorchester Review, and you can find them embarrassing themselves essentially right now with appalling comments on Twitter, on social media. The author of Alberta's social studies curriculum, which is being widely condemned and virtually shunned by every school board, almost every school board in the province that said, we're not test driving this. We're not getting behind the wheels of this draft curriculum. We're just not doing it. Back in the summer of 2019 in the Dorchester Review, quote, the ongoing fad is that we need more First Nations perspectives.
Wow.
Or on April 2nd of this year, so 2 months ago, here in Canada, the preoccupation with victimhood has mostly centered on Japanese Canadians and residential school survivors, with survivors in quotes. The Dorchester Review has been chiming in since the discovery of these 215 young bodies by pointing out, yeah, but they were mostly tuberculosis. Let's not let the politics and the cashola.
They used the word
cashola. You can find it for yourself. You can Google it yourself. So what I remember back about that time and even till now, till present day, I would guarantee if you were in a, you're lining up. I mean, let's think that we can, let's use references that would be per usual as opposed to during a pandemic. If you were at the coffee shop, or if you were on the sidelines at the kids' soccer game, or if you were at a campground, or whatever the case may be, and this came up, I do not think that you would have consensus that this was genocide. For whatever reason, people want to push back on it, whether it's a defensiveness around a religious allegiance, whether it's a defensiveness around Canada and what Canada stands for, whether it's anecdotal observations. What a powerful note we read earlier from that Canadian firefighter talking about how he's appalled, he's heartbroken. In his words, he's raging mad, recalling his own perspective of Indigenous people and how he responded to calls and how he dismissed some of those calls based on ethnicity and nothing more, and is now being washed over with awareness, is being overwhelmed with this sense of what wrong and right looks like and who the perpetrators are. To me, the public, how do I put this? The tolerance, I've lost all tolerance for any debate around whether or not this was genocide. As Jagmeet Singh said, as you said, as I think any reasonable person would say, the discovery of 2 bodies outside a school would be appalling. I'm not talking about a proper cemetery where it's a boarding school and perhaps they were hit with tuberculosis or a horrific accident happened and there are grave markers in a cemetery and a proper documented burial of 6 children that terribly lost their lives through whatever it was, the Spanish flu or TB or a terrible accident. We're talking about if there were 20 bodies outside a school. Think of how 20 bodies. 20? Try to wrap your mind around 215 bodies, all of them individuals, but all of them with something in common, right? They're Indigenous, and they were taken from their families, in most circumstances against their families' will. When we're reading stories, I'm trying to educate myself. I mean, we heard that earlier from our expert guest that let us off this morning about how she suspects that the numbers are going to be much higher because even if we're able to document human remains, they will not all be intact. As much as I hate to say it, and we've heard horrific stories, I know this show is called Real Talk, and I know that we need to hit the truth head on, but I can't even bring myself to recant or to retell some of the stories I've been reading, survivor testimony, appalling stories of how human remains were treated and disposed of. And I use the word to sound as callous as possible, disposed of, thrown away, burned. In one horrific instance I read about, burned alive. Oh. A survivor recanting a story of a girl in a residential school that gave birth to a child, the father a priest, the baby taken from her immediately and murdered. So when it comes to debate around whether or not this was genocide, talk of killing the Indian in the child, talk of bringing shame. I mean, my sister is a graduate of Bishop Grandin High School in Calgary. Calgary's Mayor Naheed Nenshi yesterday essentially putting the Catholic Board of Education on notice. They're expecting that name to change, like now. What about in St. Albert, just north of Edmonton? They have an entire neighborhood, Grandin. They have a school there. We're expecting these names to change.
And it's interesting to see businesses that have also had that name in their name.
I saw this.
There is an Edmonton-based restaurant, and they have decided they were trying to do it in conjunction with the not the neighborhood, it's an area referred to as Grandin, same namesake. And they've just said, you know what? We can't wait. It needs to change now.
So they said, bear with us while we make the name change. They haven't announced their new name yet, but they've at least stepped forward and said that we will make the change, which I think goes a long way. I think that that's a huge step.
Just saying, like, we don't have the answers. We don't know which direction, or we know what direction we're going, but we don't know what the name will be. But Grandin Fish and Chips needs to no longer be Grandin Fish and Chips. It needs to be something.
I see that Winnipeg is looking to rename Grandin Boulevard. I see that, Edmontonians are calling for a name change to Grandin LRT station.
Yeah.
These after, and here's the thing. These comments, these perspectives have been here for, in some cases, more than 100 years.
Yeah.
Right? And people are talking about, Langevin School, for example. People are talking about Hector Louis Langevin, who was a former federal minister of public works back in 1883. We're talking almost 150 years ago. Speaking to residential schools in Canada, quote, "The fact is, if you wish to educate these children, you must separate them from their parents. During the time they're being educated, if you leave them in the family, they may know how to read and write, but they still remain savages. Whereas by separating them, they acquire habit and taste. It is hoped to be only good taste of civilized people." Sounds like genocide to me. So I don't know if we can just go ahead and declare that closed, that debate in Canada. It's never been a debate for so many people. And quite frankly, it's never been a debate for the people who matter most and whose perspectives are the only ones that matter, quite frankly, at this time. I want to read more of your comments on this. It feels like, timing-wise, I'm not sure if it matters when we discuss this, but the story has, as a matter of fact, broken as we've been live on the air. Speaking of name changes, this may be of interest to people across the country. The football team, the Canadian football team based out of Edmonton, has officially announced, while we've been live this morning, its new name. And it is...
Dun, 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 Edmonton Elks.
The Elks.
Plural.
Now, first of all, wait a second. I thought plural elk is elk, but you've looked it up. You fact checked it.
Yes, yes. It says that it's acceptable to have the S, but come on.
The Edmonton Elks. So that'll be the team's name moving forward. Obviously, in the spirit of reconciliation, I think that there's obviously an Indigenous theme that runs through here. It's been a long period of time for the Edmonton football team, for the Edmonton Elks, somewhat, quite frankly, begrudgingly dragged into the conversation.
Oh, they kicking and screaming.
And there were communications around meaningful consultations around Canada's northern communities, and depending on who you talk to, and I talked to many people about it, involved, they were either sincere or insincere. In this sense and in this context, the Edmonton, this storied football team can move forward with a new brand, with a new identity, with the same and hopefully growing fan base, same colors, it looks like. And I suspect an opportunity, as a matter of fact, to generate some revenue here. Now, the bigger picture of the conversation around the health of the Canadian Football League is an entirely different conversation, and that's not one to be written off. That league's in serious financial trouble. But I think that
Ryan, we've covered a lot today.
We have.
We can't do the CFL too.
Okay. I just noted it's also, we're coming up on 2.5 hours here, so... Let me return back. I vow to continue to create space for your comments. These are emails that are sent in to us to talk at ryanjesperson.com. It's where you can send us an email anytime. Robert says, it's a struggle that I regularly have, and I've been feeling it over the weekend and into this week as it relates to the graves of these 215 children. What do I say? And who do I say it to? And how do I respond publicly? And how do I respond online? Says, I'm a Métis person, but I don't have any direct personal relationship to the residential school system. I have Aboriginal friends that do, and their stories are horrific. And generally, my approach has been to say less and to try to listen more to my Indigenous friends. And as my wise late grandfather would tell me, you have two ears and one mouth, so you should use them proportionally. He says, I see two trends online that make me cringe, despite what I believe are coming from a place of good intention, from well-meaning people. First, these performative messages that really just seem to me to be sort of like, look, I'm not one of those people, which is great, but I'm not sure, if it's really that meaningful. I don't think the intent is bad. I don't think it's necessarily wrong. But if I put myself in the shoes of people who are feeling the pain, I wonder if they might want to remind us this isn't about us. But I also understand the need to speak out, to show support, to indicate when we're not okay with something. He says, and then, of course, there are the performative messages criticizing other people's performative messages. Second, what I would describe as overreactions, huge outrage by non-affected parties to those who do share. And then those people who shared something in the bizarro world where they're forced to somewhat comfort or console the appalled, unaffected parties. People talking about how they're so outraged, they're so angry. How did they not know? And then the party that is sharing authentically something very traumatic has to, in a roundabout way, console these folks. From what I can see, this would just further drain people's energy and keep them from sharing down the line. Assuming that everyone sharing needs something to provide some sort of call to action, he says, and then I guess there's the third category of people like me who just email all of it into a talk show. My general thoughts are to put myself in the other person's shoes and think about how this would be experienced if I were them, but it's hard to do if you've not had the experience. So for me, I try to remain silent and do my best to amplify the voices of those with lived experience. I think it would be of value, Ryan, to have a guest on the show to help people navigate these difficult conversations. My personal choice, I referenced this earlier from Robert Says, was to register for the Indigenous Canada program through the University of Alberta. Robert signs off, rest in power, precious souls. It's not the type of email you just hammer out. The thought that goes into this, the sincerity, I can feel it. I appreciate this from Oriana, who wrote in to say, I'd like to acknowledge that I listen to your show, Ryan, from Treaty 6 territory, which is a traditional meeting ground, a gathering place, and a traveling route for the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, and Nakuta Sioux. I want to thank you for your Friday conversation, your Indigenous roundtable. I'm a high school social studies teacher, and I'm so grateful that there's conversations around tradition and food sustainability. My grade 10 students love learning about it when we get into the concept of globalization. She says, I'm also a second-generation Canadian. My family came from Ukraine in 1914, stewards of the land through farming and fishing and harvesting, and I'm passionate about this. But what I appreciated even more about what Connor Kerr and David A. Robertson and Joanne Saddleback had to say on Friday was about education and residential schools and Canada's own genocide. Connor said something to the tune of acknowledging genocide, and I really thought about how can I do better to label this atrocity as genocide when I teach. Not just that, but to connect it to other events that people so easily label as genocide. We teach about the Holocaust, Holodomor in grade 11 specifically, and in grade 12, and Rwanda and Darfur. And Connor made me rethink how I will add Canada's residential schools to this list. It fits the same bill. The Holocaust included atrocities of eugenics and sterilization, same as the program that existed in Alberta from 1928 through 1972, primarily focused on Indigenous youth. In Rwanda, up to 1 million Tutsis were slaughtered with a focus on children and women so they could not carry on their bloodlines, same as what the Canadian government and the church, the Catholic Church's targeted action against Indigenous peoples. I will do better to include these genocides together in discussion. We need to change the rhetoric. I truly hope that the TRC calls to action and the voices of many will help uncover these truths, as Joanne Saddleback put it on Friday's show, so that we can bring reconciliation. That from Oriana. Thank you for that. talk@RyanJesperson is where you can send your emails. We'll leave more time tomorrow for more of them. We're looking forward to that conversation. I want to remind you of a couple of partners of ours that right now are busy with their crews out at work, including Kubi Energy, based out of Edmonton, and Kamloops, BC. They're working across Western Canada right now. Solar installations helping companies and families go green. One of the biggest parts of what they offer is all the paperwork. So if you qualify for a government subsidy, kind of along the lines of what we were talking about earlier today with Dr. Samaras, Kubi does the digging, Kubi does the paperwork at kubienergy.ca. You can learn more about what they're doing. Plus, the team at Local Waste want to remind you that Trash Talk, their presentation every Friday as we wrap up our broadcast week. If you've got something you want to get off your chest, we'll get to it in Trash Talk. These are people taking opportunities to blow off a little bit of steam in good fun. But the team at Local Waste, of course, talks trash professionally. They've been doing it for a quarter century, helping their partners, their clients and customers get out of bad contracts with these big multinational firms. They'll commit their resources to get you out of a bad contract so you can start building your relationship right now with Local Waste at localwaste.ca. Coming up on tomorrow's show, very much looking forward to checking in with Senator Patty Laboucan-Benson, is going to join us, making her Real Talk debut. We'll talk about a very important government bill that she's backing as a senator. It ties into this conversation about those 215 kids. We're going to learn more about an advocacy group that's taking a look at what the average Canadian can do to focus their efforts, to focus their passion, plus canine cognition. The dog crew knew it was coming after all that cat talk. We'll talk to you soon.